close out this morning by spending some time considering the weight of forgiveness. If you have a Bible there or have your phone, you can look at the book of Luke, chapter 23. And in just a minute, we'll read from Luke 23, and we'll start around verse 26 and kind of give some context to this story. But I kind of want to set us up for what we're going to be looking at for the next 7 weeks, 6 or 7 weeks, leading up to the great celebration, this great celebration season of the church we call Easter. Leading up to that, we'll be considering the 7 final sayings of Jesus leading up to his death on the cross. I've chosen to move in this direction in my preaching for this extended period of time for a few reasons, and so I want to explain that to you here briefly. First of all, I want to look at these 7 sayings on the cross because it has to do with a massive turning point in history. There's a theologian named Fleming Rutledge. And if you're allowed to have theological crushes on people, then I have a theological crush on Fleming Rutledge. I've had it for a number of years. She's significantly older than I am. I believe she's 87 or 88. In fact, I know she is. But nonetheless, there it is. And only in Fleming's case does my wife allow for this. And I appreciate that. She is a powerhouse of a theologian who pastored for a long time in New York City. And she says this about this moment. The early Christian apostles proclaimed the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ to be the decisive turning point for all ages of the created universe. Now, after I say that, if I had a band behind me, we would do like a big timpani drum. I don't have that, so just imagine, okay, because I'm going to read it one more time. The early Christian apostles proclaimed the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ to be the decisive turning point for all ages of the created universe. That's big. She calls it an astonishing claim. And it is. The reason this matters to me as a person and as a pastor is that I prefer to live and work from the most significant moments in history. I'm not going to launch my life, aim my heart, or drive my ministry from an invention that is pointless. That would be stupid. One of the most stupid inventions I think somebody has come up with is called the Jazzercise. It is for those of you who want to have a more cut, facial, you want your jawline to be more cut. Somebody invented this. And so it's this big pillow you put in your mouth, you chill like this, and it exercises your jaw so you can have a cut jaw. Okay. I can guarantee you I'm not going to launch my life or anything else out on the basis of this Jazzercise reality. No, I want the biggest, most decisive, philosophically, theologically, spiritually, morally, the biggest moments in the history of the world to be my launching pad for everything I do. Does this ring true? Isn't this kind of how it should be? So if the cross and the resurrection of Jesus is the most significant moment and truth in human history, then it seems wise to think deeply and seriously about the events surrounding the cross and resurrection, right? Jesus' final words on the cross then take on some serious weight. And not only because someone's final words are serious weight in general, but even more so because Jesus is God in the flesh. And his final words lead up to the most significant moment in the history of the world. This is big. That's the first reason why we're going to be examining these 7 sayings from the cross. The second one has to do with signposts. What I mean by that is that Jesus' final words from the cross, as documented for us by the gospel writers, are much more than just words of closure. Jesus knew that he would emerge victorious over death. We knew this from some of the things he says leading up to the crucifixion. He knew that his death would be the final blow to sin and death itself. In fact, one writer says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. The resurrection meant that his sacrificial act of voluntarily laying his life down for the sin of the world would not be in vain. Because Paul tells us if Jesus hadn't risen from the grave, then all that he did was in vain. It was pointless. But Jesus knew that he would be victorious over death, and so that everything he was going through had tremendous weight and meaning. So I think what's happening is Jesus' words on the cross are crystallizing for us a living movement. These aren't just words of closure. I'm going to die, and so I kind of need to have my closure. No, he's crystallizing for us everything he said before, like signposts pointing to his way, to his kingdom, to his resurrection life. And so they become even more interesting and significant and weighty. And so I think what Jesus is doing is he's saying, let me say this one more time to make sure you've got it. And so he's actually re-emphasizing everything he had been saying and preaching for 3 years of ministry, of public ministry. So once again, these sayings become even more significant. That's the second reason. Here's the third reason I'm preaching kind of from this thematic framework. It has to do with our current social, global, political, and even ecclesiastical, and that just means the church, moment in which we find ourselves. There's so much confusion today, it seems to me, as to what the fruit of authentic Christianity actually is. There's a lot of confusion here. People in places of political power, people in places of significant spiritual influence, can attach themselves to Christianity and yet promote policies, practices, and ways of relating to people that fly directly in the face of Jesus. Jesus' own way of life, directly in the face of Jesus' own teachings from the Sermon on the Mount, directly in the face of Jesus' final words on the cross. And still, however, a brand of Christianity is attached to even these contradictory ways of treating other humans. This culture moment then is confusing and deeply concerning for those of us who also call ourselves Christians. Are there different brands of Christianity that can be so diametrically opposed to each other that they're unrecognizable to each other? Perhaps. Or perhaps we'll be able to distinguish forgery for what it is if we press into Jesus' own words from the cross. My prayer is that this will help. My prayer is that this will at least help us clarify what actually does the way of Jesus look like. Don't we need to understand that today? Yes. So I'm hoping these words of Jesus himself on the cross will help provide clarity for us. And then the final reason is that we're entering into the season of Lent. And as one author, Don Sailors, commented, he called Lent a double journey. He says it's a journey into the mystery of God's redemptive embrace in the death and resurrection of Christ, and it's a journey into the depths of our humanity. Do you hear that? Lent is a journey into the depths of the mystery of what Jesus does on the cross, absolutely. But it's also a journey into the depths of our own humanity. And I'll just let you know right now, it gets kind of uncomfortable down there because it's a mess. And oftentimes our hearts are part of the problem. And so during Lent, we press into the reality of our own mortality and our own moral brokenness. This is why the two most potent symbols of Lent are dust and ashes. Dust representing our mortality, and ashes representing our moral brokenness. And I think that considering these final words of Jesus will soften our hearts so that we can honestly and humbly examine the depths of our own human brokenness. The Father's words at the Transfiguration ring out to us again. Listen to him. And so we humble ourselves and we look at him on the cross and we listen to his final words to us. And so during the season of Lent, we will listen to the final words of Jesus from the cross. So that's why we're doing this. Let's jump in to the first statement of Jesus from the cross. We find it here in the book of Luke, chapter 23. And just to read it in context, I'll start at verse 26, so you can kind of get the whole idea of the story. This is what it says. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country. And they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are coming, surely they are coming, when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the womb that never bore, and the breast that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mourners, the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Jesus is speaking of a final judgment that is coming on God's own people. It's a weighty thing that he talks about throughout the Gospels, that there is a judgment that is coming, and he prophesies about it again and again, and we actually see this happen in the record of history in AD 70 when the armies of Rome came and surrounded Jerusalem, and millions of Jews were killed as Jerusalem was laid to waste. And so Jesus is describing this horrendous event that was going to take place where people would be saying, "Just let the mountains fall on us." These are weighty things. And something else is happening here too. In the midst of this moment where judgment is at the forefront, forgiveness is flowing like water. Verse 32, 2 others also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Lord, I just pray that as we think about this text for the next few moments, that you would just soften our hearts toward those in our lives who have wronged us and offended us, and that you would allow us to posture ourselves like Jesus in the way of forgiveness, that we would see the weight of your forgiveness, and that would free us to forgive others. It's in your name we pray. Amen. So let's begin this journey for the last few moments here. The story in context is weighty with judgment imagery. Luke calls the place where they take Jesus to be crucified the Skull, which is also very image kind of cultivating, as we think of this hill on which Jesus is dying with one on his right and one on his left, a criminal on his right, a criminal on his left. We're not going to be able to plumb the depths of the words that Jesus says here, but I want us to at least consider a couple of questions. The first one is, what did Jesus mean by forgive them? He says, Father, forgive them. What did he mean by that? And then he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. So what did Jesus mean by saying that they didn't know what they were doing? So that's the first two questions. And then the last question is, how are we to understand this kind of signpost or template for living in a way that would be recognizable by Jesus as the way of Jesus? So how are we to take this idea, this concept of forgiveness, and live it out in our lives in such a way that Jesus goes, yeah, that's what I was talking about? So those are the three things I would like you to consider. So here's the first thing. What does it mean that Jesus says, Father, forgive them? If you are following the life and ministry and teaching of Jesus, as the disciples had been for the last 3 years of Jesus' public ministry, something very poignant and powerful about Jesus' teaching would have stood out to you. Not only his teaching, but also his work and how he engaged with people. One of the primary themes of Jesus' life and teaching was the theme of forgiveness. So more specifically, the forgiveness of God. You remember in Matthew chapter 1, verse 21, the angel of the Lord appears to Joseph. This is back, in the Christmas story. And he tells him that Mary would bear a son, and that person, that son, would save his people from their sins. Now, the obvious question after the shock of this announcement is, well, how will this person do this? How will he save his people from their sins? Well, one of the ways he's going to do it is he's going to walk around in Palestine and in this area with all these people, and he's going to begin to demonstrate how he's going to save people both by his powerful miracles and by the powerful authority he wields to forgive sins. These two components are really important. So we get a peek at this, that sneak peek that Lynn was talking about. We get a sneak peek here at Matthew chapter 9. This is the account of Jesus healing the paralyzed man. Do you guys remember this story? A lot of the gospel writers talk about this one, and Matthew gives different details, but the other gospel writers, they talk about how his friends had to pick him up by the bed, crawl on top of the house, take parts of the roof apart so they could lower him down because the place where Jesus was too packed. And so they lowered this paralyzed man down to Jesus so he could be healed. It's a pretty cool story. Well, the most incredible thing about this story is not that Jesus heals this paralyzed man, as amazing as that is. What's actually most incredible about this story is what Matthew records in chapter 9 of the book of Matthew. Before Jesus heals the man, he does something even more dramatic than healing a paralyzed person. He says to the man with this paralyzed body, he says, "Take heart, your sins are forgiven." Now, if you would have been in that room when Jesus said that, you probably would have been one of the ones who went, "Ugh," because that's what was happening. Something had just happened that was staggering. In fact, the Pharisees picked up on it very quickly because they started talking to each other. They were getting upset because they understood the implications of what Jesus had just done. Because they knew, like everybody knew, that only God can forgive sins. Only God has the authority to forgive sinful mankind. And Jesus, a person, literally declares this broken body man, this person, this paralyzed person, he declares his sins to be forgiven. In other words, what Jesus is doing is he is claiming the very authority of God. If Jesus can truly forgive people, then he not only has superhuman power, but he also has superhuman authority. And so the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, got real nervous. And you can understand why. So the way that Jesus will save the world is by granting the very forgiveness of God that the world needs. But Jesus just doesn't talk about forgiveness as like something between God and man. He also speaks of forgiveness on a horizontal level as something that we need in our relationships and in society. It's absolutely necessary. And so he does this in another one of his stories in Matthew chapter 18, verse 21. Do you remember this story? Peter asks a question because Jesus is talking a lot about forgiveness. And so Peter's getting nervous. And so he says to Jesus, Jesus, if you want us to really live this forgiveness thing out, I have a question for you. How many times can somebody wrong us before we go all John Wick on them? You know what I'm saying? That's his question. How many times can we keep getting hurt and we keep forgiving? And so Peter's being real generous. He's like, up to 7 times? Because that would be amazing. That would be so merciful and compassionate. Surely 7 times of taking it in the chin before we kind of like Liam Nelson him. You know what I'm saying? And so Jesus doesn't answer him. You know what he does? He tells him a story. Do you remember the story Jesus tells Peter and his disciples? He says, once there was a man who owed an insurmountable debt. 10,000 talents, which in our day is over $10 million. The guy can't pay it back in a couple lifetimes. And he's brought before this person that he owes all this money to, and he says, I don't have the money. And so the person who, is out $10 million says, fine, then you and your family got to work this off for the rest of your life till you pay off every cent. And the guy knows he'll never be able to pay this off. So he falls on his knees, Jesus says, and he says, have mercy on me, and I will pay the whole debt, which was laughable. He has no way to pay this kind of debt back. And Jesus says that this individual who was owed all this money, this person in position of power, was moved with compassion. And he has mercy on this unwise person who has borrowed way more than he could ever hope to pay back. And he says, you know what? I forgive you the debt. I forgive it all. You don't have to pay me back any of it. Can you imagine? I mean, the guy's like, are you joking? Is this a joke? And so he goes out and, he goes to Big Caesars to get some pizza because in Rome they don't have Little Caesars. It's only Big Caesars. But he's at Big Caesars eating pizza and with his family and they're celebrating. They're having a crazy time. And he sees a guy over at Big Caesars that owed him $25. And so he goes over and he grabs the guy by the collar and he says, hey, you owe me $25. Pay up right now. And the guy's like, I'm sorry, I'll get it for you. I don't have it right now. He's like, you got enough to buy a pizza at Big Caesars, so you got enough to pay my $25. You give me my $20 or I'm going to take you out. Well, Jesus says that one of the servants of the guy who was owed the original debt happened to be at Big Caesars. And that's not in the Bible. I'm making that part up, just so you know. You're like, wait a second, where is that? But he overhears. And he goes back and reports back to this powerful person what has just happened. What do you think happens? This person calls him back in and says, you go get that guy and you bring him back before me. And he says, why, when I forgave you such a massive debt, could you not forgive your fellow man this small debt? It's because you've done this, the debt, the plan is off, the forgiveness is off. You now owe every single cent, and you will be working for the rest of your life until you pay this off. Now you get Jesus' point. Remember, he's answering Peter's question. Lord, how many times do I have to forgive? How many times do I have to take it on the chin before I can, revenge, get back, get angry, not forgive that person. Jesus' point is pretty clear. I think his point is simply this: there is no limit for the Christian. There is no limit to forgiveness humans should give to those who wrong them in comparison to the massiveness of the debt that we owe God. When we take part in the table of Jesus, when we take part in communion, we are recognizing that God has forgiven us a debt we could never pay. And Jesus' point is, if God forgives Stephen this massive debt that I could never repay, then surely I can forgive those who hurt and harm me. Now, this cuts against the grain of I know some of you are like, I don't know about this. And I understand. It cuts against the grain of our hearts, both positively and negatively. Positively, in that I'll ask you the question, is it right and good for us to work and move on behalf of justice? Yes or no? You don't seem very convinced. Absolutely. If you've ever read the Bible, half of it is about justice. So absolutely, Jesus was very concerned about justice, especially for the oppressed, especially for the broken, especially for the mistreated. And so this idea of forgiveness cuts against this, because we say, well, what about justice? We feel like justice is being swept under the rug if forgiveness continues to be offered to those who wrong us. It feels like justice is being threatened. But it also cuts against the grain of our hearts negatively, in that there's something in us, let's just be honest, that loves getting revenge. I'll be honest, I love watching revenge movies. Something in me goes, yeah, they deserved it. They got what they deserved. Hit him again, you know? In fact, I was buckling my son, one of my kids in, when they were like 4 years old, into the car seat one day, and he had been having some trouble with his cousins. They were like, I don't know, messing with him, and he was not happy about it. You know how it goes with cousins. And so I'm buckling him in, and he was telling me that, the cousins weren't being nice to him, and he was bemoaning that. So I'm buckling him in. He paused and he thought for a second. He said, "Dad, can we get a gun?" And it shocked me. Okay, because we weren't the kind of family that was like, letting our kids watch Rambo at 4 or something. I mean, that wasn't happening in our home. We didn't talk about, shooting people or anything like that. It was not, our kids were not playing Call of Duty at 3. None of that was happening. In fact, I thought we were actually modeling the opposite. I thought the way we talked and lived was the opposite. And so it struck me that a 4-year-old already has a posture in their heart, even if you're trying to model for them a different way of thinking about it, they have a heart that so quickly runs to revenge. It's almost automatic. And they're just 4. There's something in us that moves from justice to revenge very quickly, instead of justice to mercy and then forgiveness. So the point is that the point of all this is that Jesus considered forgiving those who have wronged us, to be a central part of what it means to follow his way. So why did he say, "Forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing"? Do you think the people who were shouting, "Crucify him," and the Roman soldiers who had put him on the cross, and the Jewish leaders who had plotted for his demise, do you think they all knew what they were doing? Well, yeah, I see some of you going, yeah. Yes and no, right? Like, they knew what they were doing. They knew what they were doing was unjust. They knew that they were doing wrong in one sense, But in the other sense, they didn't understand the weight. They didn't understand that they were on the stage of history and that history was literally turning on its axis as Jesus was being crucified. They didn't understand the breadth and the length and the height and the depth of what was happening with the love of God and the forgiveness that God was enacting through Jesus. They didn't understand all that. But I don't know that that's exactly what Jesus meant by this. I don't think he meant that they didn't know what they were doing. I think what he meant was that there's something deeper going on here that they can't access apart from grace. They can't see the deeper meaning of what is happening. They can't see the brevity and the massiveness of what is happening with Jesus taking on this sacrificial lamb-type substitution on the cross. They didn't understand the substitutionary nature of what was happening on the cross, that Jesus was literally putting himself in their place, in your place, in my place. And so Jesus is asking the Father. He's saying, Father, they don't understand the massiveness of what's happening. They are responsible for their actions, for the sin that they are committing, because they were committing a crime, the greatest crime in the history of humanity. They were actually part of that. And yet Jesus, in this moment and in the face of the greatest crime committed in human history, the innocent Son of God, shamed and crushed and crucified on a Roman cross, an instrument of torture. Jesus' words are, Father, forgive them. Now, we don't have time because I'm actually up, like literally in 2 minutes I have to stop. So how do we do this? At some other point in time, we'll walk through how justice works in this and how God's justice was satisfied and how he was able to allow mercy to triumph over judgment. We'll talk about that at some point because this is like a deep theological truth. But what I want us to think about on the way out this morning is, how do we model this? How do we live this posture of forgiveness even in this harm that people are causing to Jesus? Here's how we do it, I think. The first thing is we recognize that when Jesus says this, he's actually praying. Did you notice that? He's actually praying. He's asking God. He's doing something very beautiful. He's fulfilling a role of being a pastor or a priest on behalf of these people who are harming him, and he's praying, and he's asking Jesus for forgiveness on their behalf. And this is really important. Some of the things that people have done to us are so deep and so painful that to even ask us to forgive seems like a slap in the face, doesn't it? It might even be something someone who's so close to you, a loved one or a fellow church member or somebody a friend that used to be so close to, and to say to them, you need to forgive them because that's the way of Jesus, almost seems like trivializing your pain. And I want to say to you, the way of Jesus is not trivializing your pain. Jesus was on the cross in his greatest agony, and the way that he forgives, the way that he postures himself toward forgiveness, toward those who are hurting him, is in prayer. And I think that's the first step for all of us. The first step is that we fall on our knees and we say, Lord, this person, I want to hate them. I want to be bitter against them. I want to get revenge on them. I want their life to be miserable. But God, I don't want my heart to be like that. I want to go the way of Jesus and forgive. I think that's where it starts. Secondly, I think it's important to acknowledge that Jesus didn't just preach a great forgiveness game. He lived it in the flesh right in front of us. He didn't just say, you should forgive that person who's hurt you. He literally hung on a cross and said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Jesus demonstrated this to us in real time on the stage of history, what it looks like to forgive those who wrong us. And then I think we have to go back to Peter's question. I think we have to ask ourselves, how have we been forgiven? What is the weight of our forgiveness? And if the weight of our forgiveness is so powerful, shouldn't that change how we deal with other people who have hurt us and wronged us? And then I think the last thing, well, there's lots of last things, but one of the last things is that this takes some practice. This is a way of life. It's not going to come natural. I mean, this happened to me just a couple weeks ago. There was somebody who I felt offended me. It was a small thing, but I'm oftentimes easily offended. It was a small thing, and in my heart just went, the claws came up, all the karate that I've learned, Not really. I took it by DVD for a couple weeks, but all that started to rise. It was like I could actually feel it, all rising up. And I had to practice in that moment the practice of forgiveness. It's not natural. We have to press against that desire to claim, I have the right to get revenge. I have the right to be bitter at that person and to hate that person's guts. We have to practice what Jesus modeled for us on the cross. And it takes practice. But here's the good news. Out of the reservoir that you draw from for this kind of way of forgiveness is grace. It is God's grace. And so we stick the bucket deep into the grace of God, and we pull it up, and we dump it on us because we need grace in order to forgive those who hurt us. And this is one of the central realities of what it means to be a Christian. Did you know this? This right here is the fruit of genuine Christianity. The ability, by the grace of God, to forgive those who hurt us.